Thanks, Anthony. I know why you're all here tonight, and it's to see this fantastic guy talk about the Constitutional Convention. And I kept telling people that Chuck Johnson's going to be here, and they said, oh, he's so nice, and he's so respected, and and I don't know how many people told me that. But let me introduce him formally here for you. Chuck Johnson covered the 1972 Constitutional Convention for the Associated Press as a 23-year-old in his first major assignment in a Montana journalism career that spanned nearly 45 years. He has a bachelor's degree in journalism and a master's degree in history, both from the University of Montana. He studied economics and politics at Oxford University under a Rotary Foundation Fellowship. In May 2022, he will receive an honorary doctorate in letters from Montana State University. Johnson also served for 5 years on the Montana Historical Society Board of Trustees, and we were so lucky to have him. Please welcome Chuck Johnson.
Well, thank you all for showing up, and this should be fun. It's nice to see the Constitution get a lot of attention on its 50th birthday here, which is coming up. Montana had 2 failed attempts in the 1800s to pass a constitution. Thomas Francis Meagher was the acting territorial governor in 1866, and he just called a convention, didn't have any approval from Congress. They completed a draft, took it to St. Louis to get printed, and it disappeared. The next year, Meagher disappeared off of a riverboat, so there must have been some connection here. In 1884, the state called another one and elected William Clark, the Copper King, as president. Interestingly, Marcus Daly was also a delegate. Congress rejected this constitution for political reasons. They didn't want to admit a Republican state, a Democratic. They wanted to keep it kind of under control. So, and you needed a constitution as a condition of statehood. So in 1889, the state called another convention. Clark presided again. It won't go down in history as anything great. It was basically a very weak state constitution that hamstrung the executive and legislative branches, but it passed by a big margin with voters, and Montana in 1889 became the 41st state. So things started to change in the 1960s. The Anaconda Company's legendary grip on the state was easing somewhat. And this is a famous quote from John Gunther from the 1947. You can read it, and the cartoon's perfect match. But the Anaconda Company controlled most everything in Montana, including most of the newspapers, the daily newspapers, except for the Great Falls Tribune. And these were weak newspapers. They initially started out and going after people, but by the 1940s and 50s, they're just money-making machines. They didn't really do anything. And the Economist said it was about as bad as you could ever find. Lee bought the papers in 1959, hired some good aggressive reporters like Jerry Holleran and Dan Foley. Great Falls Tribune had John Coughlan, Frank Adams, people like that. Here was a real significant development. In 1964, the U.S. Supreme Court came out with this Reynolds v. Sims decision, and they said state legislative chambers had to be based on population in both houses. Montana, like most states, had a Senate that was based on 1 senator per county. The net effect of that was Yellowstone had nearly 80,000 people and 1 delegate, 1 senator. Petroleum, 800 people, had 1 senator. And so it was dominated by rural states. Interesting, you hear the same complaints about the U.S. Senate now, same kind of deal. Babcock said this wouldn't work in Montana. And the next day, a woman named Phoebe Herwig from Butte went to federal court and won. So they had to redistrict. It was interesting times in Montana in the 60s. You had a women's rights movement. You had student protests over the war, particularly in Missoula. Civil rights movement. The first Earth Day was in April 1970. The voting age was lowered, and labor unions were pretty strong at the time. Big environmental problems here, and you can see that pictures. GASP, Gals Against Smog and Pollution, and that was in Missoula. A lot of them were wives of professors who also had PhDs, and they were very effective. That's out by Horner Waldorf. But you had, the Clark Fork was toxic, the Bitterroot National Forest clear-cutting problems, horrible air pollution in Missoula. And then the North Central Power Study wanted to put 21 coal-fired power plants out in eastern Montana. That led to the formation of Northern Plains Resource Council, incidentally, to fight it. The legislature did a study in 1968 through its bipartisan legislative council, and they studied the 1889 Constitution. As you can see, a little bit more than half thought it should be revised or repealed. There were groups pushing for this, and I'll talk about this a little later, but they put it on the ballot in 1970 whether to call a convention. 65% of the people did it. And the leader at that time of this commission, which was made up of some prominent Montana attorneys and professors and so on, was Dale Harris, and he became the executive director at the Constitutional Convention. Well, kind of by curious fate, or maybe it was deliberate, knowing Forrest Anderson, also known as the Fox, but the state had a big battle over revenue. There was a shortfall, as there occasionally is, and Republicans under Jim Lucas controlled the Montana House. He wanted a sales tax. Couldn't get it all the way through. Big Ed Smith was one who didn't support it. And Forrest Anderson opposed it, and demos did too. They had a regular session and 2 special sessions and couldn't come up with anything. So they both decided to put it on the ballot in November, on the same ballot where the Constitutional Convention delegates are going to be picked. So the choice was this: reducing the current 40% surcharge on income tax and enacting a 2% sales tax, or rejecting the sales tax and keeping the 40% sales tax. Surtax, sorry, not sales tax. Well, Evan Barrett gave me these clippings. The 2 groups that were formed then had there was the cost group, which was the anti-sales tax group, and SOS, Save Our State. And SOS wouldn't make their books public to see who was giving money. And Judge Fall ordered them to release the data the day before the election. So this was on election day. So they had to release their donors, and it was a who's who of corporate Montana, Western Energy Company and all the phone company, MDU, all these companies. I think it had a big difference. So the sales tax got turned down 70-30, and Democrats reaped the benefits. 58 Democrats, 36 Republicans, and 2 independents. Now, the past 2 legislative sessions, Republicans had pretty significant majorities, but I think the sales tax brought the Democrats in on the con-con. The Supreme Court had ruled in 71 that current office holders like legislators, statewide officials, local officials could not run for the con-con. They'd be holding 2 jobs simultaneously, 2 elective jobs. Well, what it did is it really opened it up for anyone to run. 515 people filed statewide for 100 seats. One of the people it caused to run was a person then named Maynann Robinson, 24-year-old graduate student in Missoula. And I was in some classes with her, and she was widowed at 19, and then raising, her mother died, and she was raising a younger brother and sister and campaigning like crazy for the con-con, and she ended up finishing second in Missoula. They ran countywide. Who were the delegates? You can see their occupations. It was a pretty good mix of people. Lawyers, of course, and then farmers and ranchers, business people. even had a beekeeper, honey business owner, a radio DJ, newsman who later went to law school, Bob Vermillion, a retired FBI agent, a pretty darn good mix. And they weren't inexperienced. Legislators would come and watch it and say, oh, they don't know what they're doing. They had legislators there, ex-mayors, school trustees. You can see their religion dominated by Catholics. The oldest delegate was Lucille Spear, a retired university librarian, and Montanans was the youngest. Curiously, no Native Americans were elected. I think it was embarrassing and sad, but you have to look at the legislative districts at the time. They were elected county-wide, not from single-member districts, which they put in. And so, like up on the Blackfeet Reservation in Glacier County, they didn't have a designated area for the Native Americans to run from. And not many ran, as near as I can tell. Well, anyway, if you look to this session, where there were 21 Indian legislators, or about 8% of the total, which is pretty consistent with the population. The delegates did not forget Native Americans, and you see the article in there that Section 2, Article 10, that this is the so-called Indian education for all, where school children from kindergarten to college are taught about the unique cultural heritage that Indians brought to Montana and had in Montana. And this was not implemented for many years, but it's in full force now. So here's the president and executive director. Leo Graybill of Great Falls, a prominent lawyer, brilliant lawyer, was elected president. And Dale Harris, who'd run things before, was retained as executive director. These two did not get along at all. It was oil and water. Both brilliant. Leo was pretty arrogant and brusque, dealing with personnel things. Dale was kind of a control freak, so they did not mesh very well, even though they both tried. And Leo Graybill made the decision to let go the chief secretary, who had been a woman named Bartley Carson, and Helen, who'd been there throughout. And the staff just went wild, and they signed a letter. 58 of the 60 staffers signed a letter protesting it. And Graybill later apologized, but he did the same to other people. Brilliant as a leader, but not so good on the personnel stuff, or personal stuff. One of the good things they did that made a difference, they shared power. So they elected Leo Graybill in the center as the president. Dorothy Eck was a Democrat, Western vice president. John Toole, Republican, first vice president. You can see that. So they got everybody represented. In fairness, the legislature's kind of done that when it's been a tied House or Senate. I think this was one of the best things they did. They decided to seat alphabetically. From, I don't know how to use this, Mags Osheim up on the right corner, lower right corner, to Bob Woodmansley down in the lower left corner. And they got things done. I thought it was a big factor in them succeeding. And I wrote a couple newspaper columns suggesting the legislature ought to follow suit, but it fell on deaf ears. I still think it's a good idea. You know how they sit, one side at the other, just like Civil War armies about to go to war. You can't overstate the role the League of Women Voters played in this convention. Now, this picture is an old one. It was from '61, but they did the same thing at the convention. They would bring in the league chapters from around the state, and they'd spend a day or two up talking to their delegates. They were relentless and tireless, and they had lobbyists in the late '60s, Dorothy Eck, Daphne Bugbee Jones, and Gene Anderson of Billings, and they were really dogged lobbyists. They got what they wanted, and they worked for it. This is one of my favorite pictures. 19 of the 100 delegates were women. Doesn't seem like too many, does it? Well, the previous legislative session, there were exactly 2 women. Toni Roselle was a longtime state senator from Missoula, or Billings, pardon me, and Dorothy Bradley was a freshman in the House. They were the only 2. Today, there are 48 women in the legislature, or 32%. So better, but not, it should be up to over 50 if you look at the census. The con decidedly was not like the legislature. All committee meetings, or at least most, were open. So Graybill and the leaders met every morning at 7 or 7:30, and John Coughlan was a reporter for the Great Falls Tribune and was a tiger on open meetings, and he decided he'd go see if he could get in. And he sat down right in front of Leo's desk, put his coffee cup on the desk, and Coughlan said, "It's not an open meeting," or Graybill did, "Get out of here and take your damn coffee cup with you." Well, Coughlan became known for a couple days as Coffee Cup Coughlan, but all floor and committee votes were recorded. The legislature at that time did not record second reading votes, and these are the most significant. They come right after the debate. And so the lobbying groups, you know, Larry might write down the first 5 names and Sid the next 5. They had their lists, but the public had no idea how they voted. Same with executive action in committees, where they decide whether to amend or kill or pass a bill. Those were all closed, only the legislators. They didn't allow any lobbyists on the floor. Nowadays, they can go on after they are done. There's like a 2-hour waiting period. Lobbying groups were forced to file financial disclosure reports showing how they'd spent their money. Needless to say, they weren't very happy about that, and the legislature didn't require it until a 1980 initiative led by Paul Richards passed. They also solicited ideas from the public, and they got something like 1,500 ideas, and they took them seriously. They went into the committees and decided what to do with them. I covered one hearing on a proposal from a woman from Alberton. Her father was dying, and he wanted the right to die in Montana. So I did a story on that. It was pretty interesting, and it went national with AP. It attracted some national interest. But they had a lot of great ideas from the public, and I don't think the legislature does that, and they ought to. In evenings, instead of going out and drinking with the lobbyists, they would bring in prominent guest speakers, and Jeanette Rankin came, and Charles Lindbergh, whose son lived in Missoula, is now deceased, talked about the importance of the environment, and they had a number of other speakers, and they all show up to watch those. Jeanette Rankin talked about a new way to choose presidential candidates in primaries, a sort of proportional vote. It was very interesting. We were all hoping she'd talk about her peace effort. She was coming from the Jeanette Rankin Peace Brigades. So I'm going to go through some of the changes they made. First is the Bill of Rights, and we have an explicit right to privacy in Montana's Constitution. This is pretty unusual. Most states don't. This has kind of got a target on its back for critics. This has been used to block some bills to restrict abortion rights. And there'll be efforts again to try to change this. We have a right to a clean and healthful environment. That's unique. Ironically, that wasn't the first choice of environmental groups. They wanted something called a public trust doctrine, and it was advocated by Louise Cross, the committee chair from Glendive, but she couldn't get it out of committee. And they had a pretty mediocre environmental section. And Bob Campbell kept trying to get right to a clean and healthful environment. It kept going down. Graybill sent him a note on the floor saying, "Try your amendment again." He did, and it passed, and that's what we have in there. We have a right for the people to participate in their government, which they couldn't do much before. Have a public right to know, right to attend government meetings and inspect government documents unless the individual right to privacy clearly exceeds the public's right to know. Could talk about this all day. This has been a mixed bag. We were winning a lot of lawsuits in the media, and now it's kind of going the other way. But I hope we can get it turned around. The age of adulthood was set at 18 from 21, but later moved to 21 because the Federal Highway Department pressured the state to change it or lose highway funding. The executive branch transformed the governor into a strong governor. We previously had a very weak governor, and the previous legislative session, Governor Anderson got through the Executive Reorganization Act, and it's retained in the Constitution. The governor and lieutenant governor had to run on the same ticket, which they hadn't before. So you got some embarrassing things like the governor would leave town and the lieutenant governor would make some decision that the governor didn't agree with. You have governor and lieutenant governor from opposite parties or different factions in the party. So it works much better to have it like the presidential ticket. And the governor can make line item vetoes and mandatory vetoes. The Judicial Branch, they increased the terms for justices to 8 years and district court judges to 6. And they empowered the legislature to increase the number of justices when it deemed necessary from 5, and they did a few years later. It laid the groundwork for the governor to pick judicial vacancies through a judicial nominating commission, although that's not spelled out explicitly. Well, we had that, and that was overturned by a law in 2021, sorry. The legislative branch had met 60 calendar days every 2 years. So if they took off on Sunday, it counted against them. One of my professors, Alice Waldron, called it a 60-day pressure cooker, and that's what it was. And if they didn't finish, they would put a butcher paper thing over the clock and keep meeting, and they wouldn't get paid. And finally, a legislator sued over that. Well, they went to annual sessions, and they did it for 2 years, 73 and 74. The legislature hadn't had time to get rules in place, so a lot of bills that were introduced in 73 got held over to 74 if people didn't think they had the support. Well, it meant a lot of bills didn't get acted on, and it was a very unproductive 74 session. So the Farm Bureau, Chamber of Commerce, some of these people passed a constitutional initiative to return to biennial sessions, although 90-day biennial sessions. I always thought it was too bad they didn't get a chance to make it work. This is a key one. They set up single-member legislative districts where you can get your legislative candidates. They're going to run around your neighborhood, and you have a chance to meet them. The other thing they did, then we're seeing this right now, they set up an independent district and apportionment commission, which after every federal census, every 10 years, decides the new boundary lines for the state Senate and the House. One thing that they did that's interesting, it's been used quite a bit. For the first time, citizens and groups could propose a constitutional amendment by initiative. And then it also sets up an automatic vote every 20 years on whether to call a constitutional convention. And the next one is scheduled to be for 2030, although the legislature could put it on the ballot at any time. But it takes, I think, 2/3 of the legislators to get it on the ballot, and then the public has to vote on it, and then you'd elect the delegates, and then the public has to approve the constitution that they come up with. Education, they had one board of education that was over everything. They divided the duties into two, the Board of Regents for higher ed and the Board of Public Ed for K through 12. This one was significant. The Board of Regents now have full power, responsibility, and control of the university system. At the time, if a professor said something that legislators didn't like, they would try to eliminate that professor's job. And it really goes back to the late 1919 or 20. There was a professor in Missoula, an economics professor named Louis Labine, who did quite an interesting research paper on the taxations of mines in Montana. It concluded the copper mining company was not paying its fair share. So they went after him, and he resigned under pressure and became a distinguished professor at one of the New York universities. They also retained the ban on aid to sectarian schools. That was overturned 2 years ago by the U.S. Supreme Court in what's known as the Espinoza decision. So now people can get tax credits for making big donations to private schools. Revenue and finance, you can see here, they removed the debt limitations. They removed the 2 mil property tax levy. This is a big one. They decided to put the state in charge of assessing property, not local government officials. There were a lot of rumors that the assessor, might give his brother-in-law Joe a break on his taxes. There was a lot of inconsistency. They also set up a new system to appeal property taxes, state tax appeal board and local tax appeal boards. Two of the most important delegates just died about a month ago. On the left's Bob Campbell, and he was the author of The Right to Privacy and the right to a clean and healthful environment. Many of you probably knew Bob. He came over to the Historical Society a lot. He personally distributed hundreds of copies of the Constitutional Book and signed every one of them. And he was quite a character. Wade DeHood was one of the more prominent lawyers in Montana. He was one of the founders of the Montana Trial Lawyer. He chaired the Bill of Rights Committee and led it to what scholars say is one of the best Bill of Rights in any constitution. 10 delegates survive out of the 100. And they'll be honored in mid-June at a ceremony in the Capitol. They do this thing where they call the roll and they all sit, or their relatives, their descendants, sit in their old desks, and they call the roll and each of them makes a comment or two. It's quite moving. So you might see the grandkids of somebody talk. But a very interesting group. Many of you know George Harper, a Methodist minister. George is enormously intelligent and made a lot of great points, but one of his best functions was when the debates got hot and heavy, he'd crack a joke or something. And after DeHood spoke once, and DeHood had this booming baritone voice, George Harper said, "I feel like I'm the piccolo following the trombone section." But he just had a way to make people laugh. And he was a wise, as you all know, a wise person. But he at one point said, "Praise the Lord and pass the Constitution." That became the bumper sticker slogan. Betty Babcock of Helena played a very critical role. The delegates had squirreled away about 45,000 to use for a public education campaign after they adjourned. And immediately some groups, and they were thought to be kind of front groups for some of the corporations, stopped it with the Supreme Court said no, they weren't meeting so they couldn't spend this money. Leo Graybill was in Missoula speaking to a group and blasted the decision, and the next day he was ordered by the court to come in, and they threatened to discipline him. It was an awful, awful event in my opinion. So they had no money. And Betty Babcock said, "Well, Tim and I have the Colonial, we've got office space and copiers and phones and typewriters." And so I think the delegates, that became the headquarters, and I think the delegates to the one would say she played a very critical role in getting it passed. And that's where the pro-ratification campaign got run out of. So the convention got some national attention in Time magazine, and a writer named Jesse Birnbaum called it Montana Fresh Chance Gulch. And he called it a people's crusade. And it was a nice article, full-page article in Time magazine that got a lot of national attention. This was some of the advertising. The one on the left is the League of Women Voters poster. And then there were a lot of ads like this one. It's hard to see, but it's Citizens for Constitutional Government, that kind of thing. And they had, a million words on a page and told why it was bad. But there was a lot of interest in the campaign. So the vote was on June 6th. It skated by on the 2,532 votes, barely made it. And I think one of the reasons it made it was they were smart enough to put some of these hot button issues as sidebar votes. I think if they left the ban on the death penalty in there, it would have brought the Constitution down probably. And it may have gotten through on the strength of the gambling measure. The previous Constitution had said the legislature is not authorized to legalize gambling in Montana. Well, that doesn't mean we didn't have gambling in Montana. It just was locally regulated. And Butte voted against ratification, but I think I have these numbers here somewhere. I'll get to them. So it only won in 12 of 56 counties, mostly urban counties, lost in Silver Bow, Gallatin, and Hill. And the concern was about the tax, the environmental changes, that sort of thing. They also made a smart decision to put it on the June ballot, so that didn't give opponents as long to organize. It was a product of the progressive period of the times, and it went from the late 60s to the late 70s. I've always said if it had been called 10 years later, 20 years later, or presently, we'd have a totally different constitution. I think the Democrats deserve some credit for agreeing to share the power. The national committee man for the party was a guy named Leif Erikson. He wrote a couple columns in the paper saying, no, to the victory goes the spoils. Well, I think the Democrats were smart to ignore that advice because the public still had to vote on it, and they worked well with Republicans. The alphabetical seating was a good idea. Graybill was a strong president despite his personnel issues handling, and the staff was terrific. They put out all these reports. Here's the Bill of Rights, these 2,500 pages of books. They had a great staff with worked with Dale, Jerry Holleran, great newspaper reporter, Rich Bechtel, Rick Applegate, Roger Barber. One of my favorites was a guy named Jim Grady. And when the convention was done, he submitted a novel and got it published. His first novel didn't have an agent, 6 Days of the Condor, which got made into a Hollywood movie with 3 Days of the Condor with Robert Redford and Faye Dunaway. Very bright staff. Well, it became an issue. Some people more people voted on the side issues than on ratification. So did it pass or not? And became an issue. Now, the Board of Canvassers had to sign off on it. And Forrest Anderson was on the board, as was Frank Murray. And Murray was the Secretary of State, really an old curmudgeon. And he was mad about the Constitution because someone had put in a proposal to eliminate that office. It didn't go anywhere, but he was furious. So I got the picture here. Murray had Alec Hansen take this picture, or pardon me, Anderson did. And he signed the document, and Murray said, I didn't see you sign it. And Anderson says, well, I'll sign it for you again, you son of a bitch. And it was signed. Well, immediately the Montana Farm Bureau and others sued. The Montana Supreme Court approved the ratification on a 3-2 victory, and a federal appeals court also agreed. So it's there. I'd like to conclude by showing you the preamble, and you can all read it in your copies, but I think it's a beautiful preamble. It's some of the best Montana literature we have, and that was written by Bob Campbell and Maynann Ellingson. Maynann will tell you, the version she had was grateful to the Creator, but it got changed by someone to God. So that's the preamble, and I think it really describes Montana well, and they did a nice job with it. And the delegates will be honored, the ones that are surviving, in June, and it'd be nice to see the galleries of the House filled to celebrate what they did. I'd be happy to take any questions. If
anybody has a question, can you hear me? I'll give you the microphone. So, because we're recording this, and that way it gets recorded, the question gets recorded. So, but don't let the microphone scare you away.
Chuck, the Constitutional Revision Commission, how important was that to the lead-in? You know, the Marge Brown and number of prominent Montanans who had served on that kind of teed up everything for the convention.
It was very important. That came after the Legislative Council had concluded that, you know, a majority of the sections needed to be repealed or replaced or amended. Then came this commission, and there were 16 people, and I think Alex Blewett of Great Falls was the chair, Marge Brown. I could read you the names. I've got it here somewhere if you'd like, but very distinguished Montanans. They hired Dale Harris as their administrative assistant. So that was the beginning of the start. And then Dale hired this great staff. But without that, I think it would have been tough to pull off because they were prominent Republicans, prominent Democrats, I think the House and Senate each appointed 4, the Supreme Court appointed 4, and the governor appointed 4. So it was a bipartisan, very distinguished group. And it sort of, like you said, teed it up for the convention.
Any other questions? I'll work my way up here.
Chuck, when is the next date for considering it again?
2030. It's every 20 years.
And given the current state of Montana politics, where would you put the risk of those who regard it as a socialist rag
Well,
being able to advance that
yeah,
timeline?
it's a really, sorry. That's a really good question, Bob. Of course, as you know, politics can change in a hurry. I think events like this and there are going to be some town halls, there are going to be the things at the Capitol, they're doing some other things that will help educate people, because we've got a lot of people that, you know, weren't old enough to know about this or just moved here, and I think it's important people know about it. These weren't some cranks that put this together. I don't know of any socialists there. One of the interesting delegates was a guy named Jim Garlington of Missoula, lead lawyer of one of the biggest law firms in Montana. And he gave a wonderful speech at the end, the last day, I think, said, "This is for our children." So there were no cranks there. Well, Bob Kelleher was there, but save for Bob, and Bob was, needless to say, advocating a parliamentary system then. And but these were kind of everyday Montanans, and they weren't under any great influence by anyone. So I don't know, you know, I think there'll be the other thing the legislature could do is they could, by a 2/3 vote, could put it on the ballot and not wait for the automatic one. I don't know, you know, I haven't heard talk of that, but I'm out of the loop now. But how the voters would react, I don't know. I mean, at the time, there was a lot of praise for this, but clearly the business groups didn't like it. You know, to my knowledge, the Anaconda Company, Montana Power, didn't come out against it. But, of course, their home base was Butte, Montana, and Silver Bow County rejected it pretty decisively.
Chuck, you made the point that only 12 counties approved it, and so most of them did not approve it. Can you tell, did the delegates, all 100 delegates, sign the Constitution enthusiastically? Did they go back to their communities and campaign for it? Can you speak a little to that?
That's a good question, Pat. And Pat's my wife, in case you don't know. So everybody signed it, and they had this ceremony where, you know, Jean Bowman was the secretary of the convention. She witnessed it, and all 100 signed it. And then when some of them started going home, 9 of them ended up coming out against it, saying they didn't support it. That was kind of unusual, because I think, well, if you don't support it, why sign it? But they kind of wanted the glory, but not the. But I think that in rural areas, they got a lot of flack from the farm groups and concerned about taxes and that school costs might rise. There's a provision in there that says right to an equal opportunity to an education, and that's led to at least 2 school funding lawsuits. And I keep hearing rumors there'll be a 3rd one coming one of these days over special education funding. So. But it was mostly in rural Montana.
Chuck, I was just going to ask, do you know, I know that there were some children of different delegates that, and one I can think of is Reverend Harper's son, Hal, was a representative, and then he became Speaker of the House. Were there other delegates who had some kind of a family connection then to the legislative process as it moved forward?
I think Hal might have been the only one, and I'm not sure that. Some of the delegates later ran, like Chet Blaylock ran, Dan Harrington. I think 5 or 6 of them eventually ran for office. Max Baucus was an aide at the convention. He later ran. I'm trying to think of some of the others. Arlene Reichert served a term in the legislature. But I think, maybe I stand corrected, but I think Hal might be the only one. Dorothy Eck played a huge role, both as a lobbyist for the League of Women Voters and as a delegate. And some of you probably knew Dorothy well. Dorothy's husband, Hugo, was an architecture professor. And I read an article where Dorothy said the women's groups she went to were mostly talking about baby formula and sewing, and that didn't interest her. So she got active in the League, but she also ran the Methodist Church political unit at youth camp. And they were honoring her one time, and she inspired people like Sue Bartlett, Hal Harper, Bob Brown, Dorothy Bradley, Tom Hanna of Billings. A number of them got interested in the legislature because of Dorothy's classes at Methodist Youth Camp.
Chuck, I would be interested in just your personal reflections of covering such a monumental event at the age of 23 as a freshly minted journalist, and if you really understood the significance of what you were getting into.
I think I did to some extent, but not, as I think about it now, it was a pretty huge assignment. And there weren't many Capitol reporters. There were 3 from Lee, 2 from the Tribune, and me. And there was the Intermountain Radio Network had someone, and KBLL would send someone up now and again. But having a camera at the Capitol was not very practical. They were giant. So there weren't very many of us, and we didn't duplicate much because there was so much to cover. But yeah, I don't think I fully appreciated the significance. But I tried to read as much of these books as I could, but they all came out late. And you really want to read it. This is Rick Applegate's 415, and they were basically, they looked at the Bill of Rights in the other states, what ones were challenged in court. They were great reference books, and I used them more as a reference than reading them, but I don't think I fully appreciated the significance. I was grateful to do it.
I got a question. Why did the ag groups dislike the Constitution?
Well, I think they didn't like the 2 mil levy being eliminated. They didn't like the fact that the state would take over the assessment of property, homes and ranches, and I think there was kind of a sweetheart deal in a lot of counties where, and they actually had an incentive to have them low because then they get more school foundation money. And the Farm Bureau was probably the leading conservative group along with the Taxpayers Association in those days. And they were putting out a lot of stuff about it.
Chuck, can you comment on how the Montana Constitution ended up being as concise as it is? It's a remarkably concise document. It's still, even today, relatively uncluttered.
Yeah, David, I believe it's about 12,000 words, or it was when it was adopted, and the old one was 28,000 words. They had a styling drafting committee headed by a Billings delegate named John Schiltz. And he was Rita Sheehy's brother, if you knew Rita, and practiced law with Skeff Sheehy down in Billings. They had an amazing staffer that did this named Diana Dowling. And so they wanted to get it all in the same kind of language, so it read the same, because each committee did its own way. And they really did a nice job with it, I think. They edited it a lot. They shortened it and made it consistent.
Chuck?
Oh.
The Constitution was passed in 1972. Roe v. Wade was 1973, unless I'm wrong. Was the issue, and of course, we're going to hear a lot about this as the court cases go forward, but during the convention and during the discussion about the privacy provision, was abortion an issue?
Bob Keller had a proposal to outlaw abortion in Montana, and I think there was a proposal to legalize it, but neither of them went very far. So it wasn't talked about much. The previous year, Dorothy Bradley had a bill in to legalize abortion rights. And I remember watching the hearing. It was on a Friday night. The entire House chambers was packed. And her bill went down with only 3 or 4 people supporting it in the House. But it wasn't the issue that it would have been the next year, I think.
Chuck,
Yes,
you
Chuck.
were 23 when you had this assignment. Now, I recall when I was 23, and I don't think I would have been scared to death going into that.
I didn't say I wasn't scared.
That's what I wanted to ask you. How did you feel? I think it's tremendous.
Well, I was asked to do it, and I thought it sounded very interesting, and I had good support from the AP. I thought the assignment would go to J.D. Holmes, the longtime Capitol reporter, but they decided to have me do it because I maybe was younger, and J.D. had a busy primary election season to cover, but J.D. was of enormous help. And I followed one of J.D.'s examples. He always had a little black book. And you could ask J.D., who was the Republican state chairman in 1935, and he'd pull it out. Well, I typed in all the committees and, you know, who the delegates were, and I found it very useful. I even have my hours for my time card in here. But it took a lot of work to do it, and I never did it again. But J.D. kept his going till the end of his career.
Were the delegates volunteers, or were they paid? And if they were paid, how was that funding source developed or created?
No, I should know that, but I don't. They were paid, I think they got the same pay as legislators got, and a per diem to cover their expenses. It wasn't much.
So did the legislature approve the funding for the
Did.
delegates?
They had to appropriate the money for the convention. And, you know, a lot of the bills were the same, like printing what became the proposals, not laws, but so they had to print everything, and they had to hire staff. They had, you know, secretaries and security, and I think there were about 60 employees. You know who might know is Ed Smith is here, and Ed was the reading clerk. Do you know Ed? What was their salary?
Was the salary?
What did delegates get paid? Do you know?
You know, Chuck, I don't know. I think you're correct in that it was, they got the salaries of what the legislature had received in '71.
Wasn't much, but I don't think they were there for the
Right.
money.
And then the per diem, right.
And an interesting thing is a lot of them became very close friends, and you know, Bob Campbell would organize reunions down at Bannock, and they all became pretty good friends, I think.
Do we have any more questions?
Yes? Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I forgot to ask. How long did the process take from the beginning when they decided to do it till they finished?
Well, the vote to call a convention was in 1970 in November, and they had this commission that sort of oversaw it, and they hired the staff that worked for Dale Harris. They came to town in mid-January, and I think they were done late March, if I'm not mistaken, and I think they met 54 days, something like that. And they kept a tight lid on the budget so they could save money to run a public education campaign. And then, of course, that money was taken away. But, you know, Leo Graybill, you can criticize him for some things, but he really kept them on schedule and at times was a taskmaster, but they needed to finish on time. You know, they were opening themselves for great criticism if they stayed all spring. So there was a need to get the job done.
Any more questions?
Hi. Could you expound a little bit on how they limited the lobbyist influence over the session?
Yeah, the legislature previously was kind of seen as a haven for lobbyists. And back in the day, until the late 60s, I believe, they had a Montana Power and Anaconda and the railroads had what they called watering holes. And they'd rent a suite at Jorgensen's or the Placer Hotel, and they'd have a chef there cooking baron of beef, and they had, beer and wine and liquor there. And it was sort of like, well, they can just get to know each other. And back in the day, before there was a legislative council, if you came from Scobie or, Wolf Point or Dillon and had a bill you wanted to put in, you had to hire a lawyer to draft the bill. Well, the power company and Anaconda would draft bills for you for nothing. But there weren't any bills to increase the taxes on mining or toughen the consumer regulation of utilities. So that lobbyists, it was kind of a smoke-filled room before. And these delegates did not want that to happen. So by not allowing them on the floor, that was one way. And then a lot of them didn't go out, they always had invitations. They chose not to go. And the lobbyists were very unhappy. They felt like they weren't willing to listen to them, and to some extent that's true. But the other thing is, by opening all the meetings, the public could watch too. Previously, the lobbyists, they might not be able to into the closed executive session, but as soon as they got out of there, a legislator would tell them what happened. So they made the decision basically not to allow them on the floor. And by also require them to file these reports showing how much they spent. Well, the old Helena lobbyists were furious. And they were not happy. A lot of them didn't like the Constitution. They felt it was a step in the wrong direction. But the delegates, I think, felt it was important to show that it was a public constitutional convention. No closed-door meetings, except for the one maybe. And it was, they saw how the legislature worked, and they didn't want to have it anything like that.
Chuck, did Forrest Anderson stay out of the whole picture?
That's a good question, Bonnie. Forrest Anderson was very much for this, but he felt by being actively involved, it would hurt it at the polls. So he was behind the scenes, I think, doing things, but he was not out there telling them what to do, that's for sure. And it was a smart strategy. He'd gotten this massive executive reorganization bill through the previous legislative session. Before that, all the departments were headed by a board, a 7-member board, and the governor didn't get a majority of that board till the governor's 4th year. And the example of that is the Montana Livestock Department. It still does it that way, and I would argue has struggled with management ever since. And that's owing to the power of the Montana stock growers and the wool growers and that sort of thing. It's ridiculous because the governor can't pick a director. It's picked by the board. So Anderson was, as you know, very smart, very savvy, probably the best qualified person to ever be governor. He'd been a legislator, a county attorney, Supreme Court justice, AG for 12 years. But he knew enough to kind of stay out of there. But I'm sure through certain people, he let them know what he thought. And I think the candidates that were running for governor were cautious they wanted to see what the outcome was too. You had Tom Judge against Dick DeZevi in the Democratic primary, and you had Ed Smith versus Frank Dunkel in the Republican primary. So there was people kind of waiting to see what happened.
Chuck, you may have retired some years ago, but you are an ongoing student of this for having covered it. And I'm just curious to hear what you think the greatest weaknesses and the greatest strengths have been since it passed in '72. What are the provisions most at risk, and what are the ones that have been unfailingly successful?
Well, I think the weakest article, Bob, is the judiciary article. And it's kind of a screwy system. So if a governor appoints a judge or justice, the person has to be confirmed by the Senate. Then the person has to run in the soonest general election. And then if the term ends 2 years later, the person's got to run again. So you can have a new judge running twice in 4 years and going through Senate confirmation. The reformers wanted to go to what they called the Missouri Plan. And that was where a governor would make an appointment, and I think there was Senate confirmation. And then in two years, the voters would decide whether to retain or not retain Judge Smith or Justice Jones. But the chairman of that committee was a guy named Dave Holland in Butte, and he didn't like that. And there were great battles over that. The reformers also wanted JPs in every county to be attorneys. That was a good idea in theory, but a lot of smaller counties might have one lawyer, and that person was the county attorney. So that didn't work. But I think most delegates would tell you that was the weakest article. The best, I think the Bill of Rights is really strong. The legislative article was strong, but kind of got gutted with the defeat of annual sessions. I think the environmental and the environment article is pretty good. It isn't public trust like some of the environmental groups wanted, but it's pretty strong. And there was a decision, I believe in '99, that made it self-executing by the Supreme Court, maybe '97. I think the author was Terry Treeweiler, maybe Jim Nelson, but I think it works pretty well, and there have been a lot of cases involved. And I think the critics of the Constitution, that would be one of the articles they don't like, is the right to a clean and healthful environment.
I have a question.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Do we know how many states have followed the example of Montana with this, as far as what we did in 1972?
A number of states tried it, and it didn't work. I think we're the third newest constitution. I should know this, but I don't know which the states are. There was a period in the late 60s, early 70s, a general reform period, where states tried it. But it's a tough road to overcome. If you don't like one part of the Constitution, you might vote against it.
Any more questions? Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you.